I am Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia. You know me as Vlad the Impaler, though my own people called me different names. Let me tell you how a hostage prince became the terror of the Ottoman Empire and the defender of Christian Europe, though my methods would horrify even those I protected. Born in Sigashora, Transylvania in 1431, my early life was shaped by violence and betrayal. My father had taken the name Dracula, dragon, after joining the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christianity against the Ottoman Turks. I became Dracula, son of the dragon, but would soon learn that oaths meant little in the savage politics of the Balkans. The Wallachian throne was a deadly prize. My father gained it, lost it, and regained it through a combination of force, bribery, and shifting alliances. I learned early that survival meant being stronger and more ruthless than your enemies. Even family couldn't be trusted. My own uncle had murdered his predecessor to gain the throne. Let me tell you about becoming a hostage. In 1442, my father was summoned to pay tribute to Sultan Murad II. He took me and my younger brother, Radu. But this was no mere diplomatic visit. We were kept as hostages to ensure my father's loyalty. I was 11 years old when they locked us in the Ottoman fortress of Erigöz. Those years in Turkish captivity shaped everything I would become. While my brother Radu thrived, embracing Turkish customs and eventually converting to Islam, I grew hard and bitter. They tried to break me through beatings, through humiliation, through attempts to force me to convert. Instead, I learned from my captors, their military tactics, their ways of terror and intimidation, and most importantly, their method of impalement. The Ottoman court was a masterclass in cruelty and power. I watched how the Sultan maintained control through fear, how he dealt with enemies, both external and internal. Daily executions were common, hanging, beheading, and yes, impalement. I studied every detail, storing away knowledge I would later use. The Turks thought they were teaching me submission. Instead, they were creating their worst nightmare. Radu's betrayal cut deeper than the Turkish whips. My own brother became the Sultan's favorite, converting to Islam and adopting Turkish ways. While I was beaten for defiance, he was rewarded for submission. We who had once been inseparable became strangers, then enemies. This too taught me something. Blood ties mean nothing compared to power and survival. In 1447, the news reached us. My father and older brother Mircea were dead. Hungarian nobles had murdered my father, while Mircea was buried alive by the boyars of Târgoviște. I was 16, still a hostage, when I learned I was now rightful prince of Wallachia. The Turks saw an opportunity. They would release me to rule as their puppet. They didn't understand what those years of captivity had created. My first attempt at rule lasted barely 2 months. The boyars, Wallachia's noble class who had helped murder my father, drove me from the throne. I fled to Moldavia, then to Hungary, where my cousin John Hunyadi offered protection. He saw me as a useful tool against Turkish expansion. I saw him as a means to regain my birthright. These years of exile taught me patience and deception. I learned to smile at enemies while planning their destruction, to make alliances I intended to break, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Hungarians thought they were training a loyal vassal. The Turks thought their former hostage would remember his place. Neither understood that I had my own plans. I studied warfare intensely during this time. Hungarian military tactics, German firearms, the organization of mercenary armies. I learned it all. But more importantly, I studied how to break men's spirits, how to use terror as a weapon. The Ottomans had taught me that fear was often more powerful than armies. My marriage to Ilona Szilágyi, a Hungarian noblewoman, was part of this calculated rise. Through her, I gained closer ties to the Hungarian court and access to their resources. She thought she was marrying a noble exile. She would later learn she had married a monster of her own kind. By 1456, my opportunity came. Hungary was ready to install me as their candidate for the Wallachian throne. The Turks were distracted by other conflicts. The boyars were weakened by internal feuds. Everything I had learned about warfare, about cruelty, about power, was about to be put into practice. Those who later called me monster didn't understand that Wallachia needed a monster. Caught between the Hungarian hammer and the Turkish anvil, only terror could preserve our independence. I would make my enemies fear me more than they feared each other. The impaled corpses that would soon line our roads were not just revenge. They were a message written in blood. My brother Radu remained with the Turks, their perfect puppet prince waiting to replace me. Let him wait. I had survived their prisons, their torture, their attempts to break my spirit. Now I would show them what they had created. The boy they had tried to break would become the man they most feared. The dragon's son was ready to breathe fire. When I retook Wallachia in 1456, my first task was to settle scores with the boyars who had betrayed my father. The traditional Easter feast provided the perfect opportunity. I knew these nobles well, their greed, their treachery, their constant plotting. They came to celebrate. They stayed for a very different kind of party. I let them eat and drink their fill, watching them grow comfortable in their arrogance. Then I asked them a simple question. How many princes have you served and betrayed? Some tried flattery, others pleaded ignorance. A few of the older ones had indeed served in the reigns of up to 11 different princes. Wallachia's throne had changed hands that often due to their plots and betrayals. What happened next would establish my reputation forever. The older boyars, who had seen multiple princes come and go, I impaled immediately. The younger ones and their families I marched to Poenari, where they would rebuild an old mountaintop castle with their bare hands. They worked until their clothes fell off their backs and their hands bled. Most died during the construction. I needed a fortress, and they needed to learn the price of treachery. Let me tell you about my preferred method of execution. Impalement was an art I had learned from the Turks, but I perfected it. The stake had to be rounded, carefully oiled, not too sharp. If it was too sharp, death came too quickly. I wanted them to linger. My men would insert the stake with expert precision, avoiding vital organs. A victim could live for days, raised high in the air as an example to others. The boyars' families weren't spared. Wives, children, all met the stake. Mercy, I had learned, only breeds future enemies. A dead man's son becomes your future assassin. Better to eliminate the entire bloodline than face revenge years later. By the time I finished, most of Wallachia's noble families had been exterminated. This was not mere cruelty. It was calculated terror. I replaced the old nobles with a new class loyal only to me. Some were common-born soldiers, others minor nobles who had proven their loyalty. They knew their position depended entirely on my favor. More importantly, they had seen what happened to traitors. My policy toward the Saxon merchants of Transylvania followed similar logic. They had supported my enemies, so I burned their towns, impaled their leaders, and forced them to submit to my authority. The famous forest of the impaled outside Brasov, 2 miles of thousands of stakes with rotting corpses, sent a clear message about the price of defiance. Trade was essential to Wallachia's economy, so I established strict rules. Merchants had to follow specific routes, pay exact tolls, and deal fairly with my people. Cheating a Wallachian customer meant death by impalement. To prove my fairness, I placed a golden cup in the central square of Târgoviște. Anyone could drink from it, but none dared steal it. They knew the consequence. Crime virtually disappeared under my rule. Adultery, dishonesty, theft, all meant the stake. I once received a complaint about frequent thefts at a merchant's fountain. I replaced the ordinary cup there with a magnificent golden one. It remained untouched. Fear proved a more effective deterrent than any law. The Ottoman emissaries arrived in 1459, demanding their annual tribute of money and young boys for their Janissary corps. I invited them to an audience, knowing their Turkish custom of refusing to remove their turbans before a Christian ruler. When I asked why they disrespected me so, they cited their religious custom. "Then I shall help you keep your customs," I replied, and had their turbans nailed to their heads with small iron nails. This was no mere cruelty. It was a declaration of independence. For too long, Wallachia had paid tribute in both gold and children to the Ottoman Empire. I had watched those children become janissaries during my captivity. Now I would end this practice, whatever the cost. Sultan Mehmed II's response was predictable. He sent his best general, Hamza Bey, with an army to teach me obedience. Hamza tried deception first, inviting me to a false peace conference. I knew their tactics. Hadn't I learned them in their own court? Instead, I ambushed their army, captured Hamza, and created a forest of stakes with his men. Hamza received the highest stake, as befitted his rank. My night attack on the Ottoman camp in 1462 nearly changed history. With a small force of mounted men, I infiltrated the Sultan's camp disguised in Turkish clothing. We knew their passwords, their customs. My years of captivity served me well. We sought the Sultan's tent, hoping to kill Mehmed himself. We missed him but slaughtered thousands and spread panic through their army. Let me tell you about my most famous act. The forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish corpses that greeted the Ottoman army. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the most powerful ruler in the world, was said to have turned back in horror at the sight. His hardened soldiers, used to war's brutality, were sickened. "What can we do against a man who does such things to his enemies?" they asked. My tactics were simple but effective. I employed scorched earth policy, poisoning wells, burning crops, and forcing my own people to retreat to the mountains and forests. The massive Turkish army found only death and desolation. Disease and starvation weakened them more than any battle could. The psychological impact of impalement cannot be overstated. I carefully arranged the stakes by rank. Officers higher than common soldiers, commanders on horseback on their horses. The dying would linger for days, their screams demoralizing any who passed. This wasn't just execution. It was psychological warfare on a massive scale. My own brother Radu, now the Sultan's puppet, led armies against me. The Turks thought his claim to Wallachia's throne would rally support. Instead, I made examples of any who joined him. Loyalty to a Turkish puppet meant impalement for entire families. The stakes along our roads served as constant reminders of the price of treason. My greatest victories would lead to my downfall. King Matthias of Hungary, supposedly my ally, grew fearful of my growing power and reputation. While I fought the Turks, he plotted against me. The letters arrived in late 1462, supposedly intercepted correspondence between me and the Sultan, suggesting I planned to betray Hungary. The letters were forgeries, of course. I had fought the Turks too brutally, sacrificed too much to ever consider alliance with them. But Matthias needed a pretext to remove me. When I arrived in Buda to meet with him, thinking to discuss military strategy, I was arrested instead. The dragon's son had been outmaneuvered by political snakes. Let me tell you about those years in Hungarian captivity. They held me first in Buda, then in Visegrad Fortress. This was no Ottoman prison. I was treated as a noble prisoner, allowed books, visitors, even the company of women. But gilded chains are still chains. For 12 years, I watched as my brother Radu ruled Wallachia as a Turkish puppet. Matthias was cleverer than most realize. He kept me alive as a threat, a weapon he could unleash against the Turks if needed. I was allowed to marry again, to a member of the Hungarian royal family. Some say I even dined with the king occasionally, discussing military strategy. But I never forgot that beneath the courtesies, I was still a prisoner. My imprisonment wasn't entirely wasted. I read extensively: military treaties, historical accounts, religious texts. I learned new languages, studied Hungarian military techniques, and made connections among the noble prisoners. Even in captivity, I was preparing for my return to power. The stories about my continued cruelty during imprisonment are mostly true. They say I caught rats in my cell and impaled them on tiny wooden sticks, that I would request birds from the castle courtyard only to mutilate them. Perhaps I was maintaining my fearsome reputation. Perhaps captivity had truly driven me mad, or perhaps I simply needed to practice. News reached me of Radu's death in 1475. My treacherous brother, who had chosen Turkish favor over family loyalty, died of syphilis, a fitting end for an Ottoman puppet. But Wallachia was still not free. The Boyars and Turks had installed yet another weak prince they could control. During my imprisonment, the legend of Dracula grew. German printed pamphlets spread tales of my atrocities throughout Europe. They called me vampire, monster, demon in human form. Stories circulated of me dining among forests of impaled victims, dipping my bread in their blood. I never denied these tales. Fear is a weapon that works even from behind prison walls. My release from prison came in 1475, when Matthias of Hungary finally needed me. The Ottoman threat had grown too large to ignore. I converted to Catholicism as part of the deal, a small price for freedom. They thought 12 years of imprisonment had broken me. They were wrong. The dragon's son had merely been waiting, planning his revenge. I returned to Wallachia in 1476 with Hungarian support, reclaiming my throne for a third time. The people still remembered me. How could they forget? The forests of stakes might be gone, but the stories remained. Some welcomed me as their protector against Turkish oppression. Others fled in terror, remembering my methods of maintaining order. My final reign would be brief but bloody. The Boyars had grown comfortable again during my absence, returning to their old ways of corruption and plotting. I resumed my old methods. The stake remained my preferred tool of justice. But something had changed. The world had changed. Perhaps I had changed too. Let me tell you about my last battle. It came in December 1476 near Bucharest. The Turks had sent another army, aided by my old enemies among the Boyars. I led a night raid on their camp, my signature tactic that had worked so many times before. But this time was different. Someone had warned them. Someone had betrayed me. They say I died fighting, cut down while leading a charge against Turkish forces. Others claim I was assassinated by disloyal boyars in my own army. Some peasant legends insist I didn't die at all, that the dragon's son merely retreated to the mountains, waiting to return when Wallachia needs him most. The truth? An arrow in the back before I could reach the Turkish lines. As I fell from my horse, I saw my own men retreating. The boyars had betrayed me one final time. My last sight was of Turkish cavalry approaching, their curved swords catching the winter sunlight. At least I died in battle, not on a stake like so many of my victims. The Turks cut off my head and preserved it in honey, sending it to Sultan Mehmed as proof of my death. He displayed it on a stake outside his palace in Constantinople, a final irony that I might have appreciated. My body was buried at the monastery of Snagov, though some say the tomb is empty. My methods were cruel, yes, but I held back the Ottoman Empire when all of Christendom trembled before it. I kept Wallachia independent when larger nations submitted. Through terror and impalement, I created order from chaos and strength from weakness. Would you understand my true legacy? Not just the tales of cruelty, the forests of stakes, the rivers of blood. I showed that even a small nation could resist an empire if its leader was willing to be more ruthless than his enemies. Every Romanian who tells tales of Vlad Tepes today speaks with a mix of horror and pride. The legends grew after my death. Bram Stoker would take my father's name, Dracula, and create a fictional vampire that bears no resemblance to the real prince who fought to keep his nation free. But perhaps he captured something true about me. The price of immortality is blood, and those who wish to rule forever must become monsters. I am Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon Prince of Wallachia. I died as I lived, by violence and betrayal. Judge me if you wish, but remember this. In a world of wolves, only the most feared wolf survives, and for a time the dragon's son was the wolf that even the Sultan feared.